Okay, let's pick up where we left off and look at the changes affecting the operating landfills and permit applications. Waste characterization. This applies only to residual class landfills. Waste characterization is the key for this landfill class. The liner and the setback from the uppermost aquifer system is established to be protective for waste that meet the concentration limits established in this rule. I'll explain the process here a little bit more in depth for a benefit of the formerly industrial solid waste folks. First off, we merged rules 3 and 4. For each industry, there is a parameter list. We do allow alternatives if they're justified, and something new if adding a parameter not on the rule list, its cutoff is 30 times the maximum contaminant level, and if there is no MCL, then it is 30 times the regional screening level. The rule has instructions for composite sampling, when mixing of generated waste stream samples is allowed, and something new, if co-disposal of individual waste may increase concentrations, then you may be asked to mix those wastes prior to sampling. So for example, a waste with a lot of metals, it's fine on its own, and a waste with a low pH, and it's fine on its own. Yet when they're co-disposed, yikes, out come the metals. So we don't want to be blind to that eventuality. Something else that is new is we expanded the allowable methods to generate a leachate for testing. In addition to TCLP and the synthetic leaching procedure, we'll also accept parallel batch extraction, percolation column, and semi-dynamic tank leaching. Lastly, there are instructions for checking the waste annually to make sure it still qualifies for disposal in a residual class landfill. Now, what happens if that annual sample fails? You will do 2 resamples of the suspect waste within 75 days, and you can limit that analysis to the offending parameter. You don't need to do all of them. Both need to come back as passing to reject that first test. If not, disposal of that waste needs to cease. Options for the owner-operator are to restart the characterization process to see if with more samples the statistics will pass. And then the other option is to submit a permit to install to upgrade future liner construction, which, by the way, in this case, the redesign is not an alteration because it would be a change in the type of waste received at the facility, which qualifies as a modification. Now I'm going to address the permit application. We replace the QA/QC plan with a table of pass-fail criteria. And we specifically ask if there are any monocells or monofells. This is an issue for secondary aluminum production waste by statute, but there may be other reasons why an applicant would want to establish a monocell or monofell. Otherwise, the edits capture changes made to the siting and the design and construction rule, which I'll be covering next. PTI approval criteria. This is where siting criteria is established. Most of the edits here are cleaning up the rule. The big change is where a siting criterion used to apply to the entire facility, now it applies to the sources of contamination. So for example, the limits of waste placement, leachate storage structures, leachate lift stations. Not a change, but just a reminder, the isolation distance from the uppermost aquifer is 5 feet for a residual landfill and 15 feet for an industrial landfill. Design and construction. This rule applies to the permit application. There's a little bit that applies after permit issuance, but the changes we made are to the design standards, which come into play in the permit review. We added a lot of components. We have standards from the Industrial Solid Waste Program for the foundation. That includes in situ materials, the subbase, added geologic material. Got stuff in there for structural fill, geosynthetic clay liner, flexible membrane liner, cushion layer, and separatory liner and leachate collection system. The cap design is still in the closure rule, but the cap components are added here in Rule 07. This would include the barrier layer, the drainage layer, and the protection layer. New, never before seen requirements are seepage forces and piping failure and electrical leak location for the liner FML, not the cap, but the bottom liner flexible membrane liner. We also added some other improvements to FML construction, one of which is wrinkle height, but mostly these facilities that are residual anyway use a PVC liner, and wrinkling is not as much of an issue as when high density polyethylene is used, but we do have that new wrinkle standard for deployment of flexible membrane liner. Now do make a note to yourself. We view the liner and the cap as a system. So if you decide to revise just one of the components in your design, updates to the other components will also be applied. And I'll go in depth a little bit later on that issue. Other changes we made to the factor of safety for undrained static slope stability. Acceptance of deformation analysis for seismic slope stability, and we simplified some of the soil specifications. Okay, big design changes were made to the liner and the cap design. These two design options are available to all IMW landfills. If you focus on the left and think of that as the default design, it has 36 inches of recompacted soil at 10⁻⁷. The design on the right is the GCL version of that option. Note that the recompacted soil liner is 12 inches at 10⁻⁵, not 10⁻⁷. Now for residual landfills, there are 3 more options. The one on the top left, you can think of that as the default for this class. The recompacted soil liner is 18 inches at 10⁻⁷, and the GCL option on the top right is placed on a good subbase. There is no recompacted soil liner per se. If the waste is low in chloride, we don't need the flexible membrane liner. Note that the thickness is back up to 36 inches. And I'm going to skip to the closure rule for a moment to go over the cap designs. There is no difference in the cap design based on the landfill class. As with the liner presentation, the design on the top left you can think of as the default option, and the design on the top right is the GCL version of that option. Then, if the waste is of low permeability, meaning less than 10⁻⁵ centimeters per second, then there is no recompacted soil barrier layer, CSBL. The waste is basically doing that job. And here is a special provision if putrescible waste was disposed. The cap will need gas controls to relieve the gas pressure buildup under the FML. As a reminder, if you want to change the permit to adopt a new liner design or cap design, it is an alteration unless the limits of waste placement will be extended, in which case it is a modification and will require a permit. Note that although you may only be changing the recompacted soil liner thickness, we see the liner and the cap as a system. The reason we can go with a thinner component is due to the upgrades that we made in the flexible membrane liner construction standard. So the alteration or modification will need to include those updates as well. On to closure. Besides the cap design changes, the big change here is that instead of a notice in the paper about impending closure, we changed that to posting a sign at the facility, and that would be 90 days prior to when you think the facility will be closing. Operations. Here are some things that you will need to do right away. You might already be doing these. It depends on which program you're coming from, but the last one will be new for everybody. You'll need to deposit waste at the working phase and spread and compact it. Waste will need to be strong enough to support operation equipment and activities. You'll need to control litter. And the new item, identify backup treatment facilities in your leachate contingency plan. Other operational requirements are for new landfills. You cannot dispose of waste into the first phase until you attain concurrence from Ohio EPA that the phase is ready for operation. For all new phases, you cannot dispose of waste into the phase until the closure and post-closure cost estimates are adjusted and the financial assurance funded. Now, that may already be taken care of through funding of the worst case scenario, but we want to confirm that there is indeed enough financial assurance before opening up new area. We added a select waste layer requirement. It's applicable more so for the 8th industry since we don't know what sorts of items will be going into the landfill. But for the formerly residual solid waste facilities, this change won't affect you much. Basically, if waste has items longer than 2 feet in length, or consists of fines that can clog the leachate collection system, then you will need a select waste layer. Otherwise, the waste can be used as is, but you will need to record it in the daily log. Daily cover is required if the waste is putrescible, odorous, dusty, combustible, or reacts exothermically. We made it so this requirement is established in the permit or license, so you don't have to guess if this requirement applies to you. Daily cover is to be removed or prepared before the next lift of waste is put down if it could impede leachate flow to the leachate management system. And that provision also applies to intermediate cover. Intermediate cover is required if the permeability of waste is greater than 10⁻⁵ centimeters per second. Note that if there is no cover over the waste, that the runoff is leachate. So for surface water management purposes, you may want to or need to apply something to keep that surface water clean. For annual reports, the limits of emplaced waste are to be compared to the authorized waste limits on a cut fill map. And if it's off by more than 2 feet, then you're going to also need to note the dimensions and the volume. We want the annual leachate sample to be taken from inside the landfill. This applies to both industrial and residual class landfills, but it is more crucial for a residual landfill. We want to know what the quality of the leachate is where it'd be leaking into the groundwater, not say after it's been aerated or sitting in a tank. But if that's not possible, then take the sample from the tank or wherever. Variance rule 15. This is the last rule in the package. This rule was drastically trimmed down simply because the process was redundant with what's in Chapter 27, Rule 3. So now the rule just references OAC 3745-27-03. So much shorter rule. And here is my contact information.